You know we love Jaden and Maurice. And you know that you could have gave them kids to us and we would have took care of them. I want you to suffer just like I'm suffering right now.
The entire town of Shepherdsville is left in shock, unable to comprehend what just happened. But the most chilling part? The warning signs were always there, we just didn't look close enough. From hallucinations involving a PlayStation to secret texts with a mysterious man, Tiffany Lucas believed she wasn't killing her children. She was saving them from evil. This isn't just a crime story, it's a wake-up call for us all. And you're about to witness 45 minutes of one of the most heartbreaking and haunting cases in modern America. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe for more true stories told fully, fearlessly, and with a voice that never looks away from the truth. Under a bleak gray sky of a December morning, Shepherdsville, Kentucky lay cloaked in its usual damp chill. The wind howled through the narrow streets, shaking bare trees and rattling loose Christmas decorations hung outside modest homes. Along Bentwood Drive, families bustled about, preparing for the holiday season. Everywhere, festive lights flickered in puddles. Children's laughter mingled with the distant bark of neighborhood dogs. It seemed like any ordinary morning. No one could have imagined that just a few doors down, a nightmare was quietly unfolding, silent, deliberate, and far deadlier than any winter storm. House number 219 on Bentwood Drive, a weathered one-story home with peeling white paint, sat motionless, almost hiding in plain sight. Strings of unlit Christmas lights drooped sadly across the front porch, their colors muted under the gray light. Inside, the air was thick, oppressive, carrying a sharp, metallic scent that clung to everything like an unseen fog. Tiffany Lucas' mother, to two young boys, stumbled through the living room. Her eyes were vacant, her hands trembling violently. Disjointed words slipped from her cracked lips, fragments of thought that made no sense to anyone but herself. Beyond the closed door, the outside world carried on, oblivious, as the seeds of tragedy took root behind those fading walls. The atmosphere within that small house was suffocating, as if the walls themselves conspired to trap the horror within. The two little boys lay motionless in their shared bedroom, the bedsheet stained deep red. Blood pooled in dark patches across the worn mattress, silent witnesses to a crime no one could yet comprehend. Out on the street, neighbors continued their morning routines. A man strung lights along a porch railing. Kids laughed as they tossed snowballs near the curb. Christmas music floated gently from a nearby radio. Life, so ordinary and unaware, bustled along just feet away from unimaginable horror. A gust of icy wind ripped a holiday flyer from a mailbox, sending it spinning into a tangled bush. Inside the house, Tiffany Lucas whispered to herself about unseen threats, about being manipulated by dark forces she could neither name nor fight. Her reality, if it could still be called that, had shattered, leaving behind only chaos and a terrible sense of inevitability. The cold, damp weather seemed to press even harder against the house, like a physical weight. As delivery trucks rumbled past carrying holiday packages, no one on Bentwood Drive realized they were passing the epicenter of a tragedy that would soon shatter their community. A lone black crow swooped down and perched atop a telephone pole, its beady eyes reflecting the dim morning light. It watched the silent house below, as if sensing the darkness gathering within. In mere moments, sirens would pierce the air, screams would shatter the stillness, and Bentwood Drive would be forever changed. But for now, there was only silence, a heavy, terrible silence, and a house that kept its darkest secrets hidden just a little while longer. A crime was being born slowly, coldly, irrevocably. Shepherdsville, a name once ordinary, would soon be etched into the nation's memory for reasons no one could ever forget. And it had only just begun. A blood-curdling scream tore through the cold, still morning, echoing off the tightly shut houses along Bentwood Drive. It wasn't a sound anyone in Shepherdsville was used to hearing, desperate, raw, and so haunting that even the neighborhood dogs snapped awake, barking frantically into the wind. Some neighbors peered cautiously through their windows, squinting against the dim light, a knot of unease forming in their chests. Then they saw her, Tiffany Lucas, the young mother from house number 219, stumbling out onto her driveway. Her dress was smeared with dark stains, her bare feet slipping across the freezing concrete. Her mouth moved in a frantic whisper, repeating one terrible phrase over and over, "My babies are dying, my babies are dying." In an instant, the peaceful street turned into a scene of confusion. James, a middle-aged man living directly across the street, rushed outside without even zipping his coat, heart pounding as he sprinted toward the collapsing woman. He reached Tiffany just as she crumpled to the ground, clutching her head, her body racked with tremors. James knelt beside her, trying to rouse her, calling her name, but Tiffany didn't respond. She only muttered that horrifying phrase, over and over, caught in some nightmare from which she could not wake. Other neighbors stood frozen on their porches, unsure whether to move closer or stay put. A primal instinct warned them that something far worse than anyone could imagine had just happened. Driven by urgency and the instincts of an ex-firefighter, James made a decision. He bolted toward Tiffany's house. The front door was ajar, creaking ominously as he shoved it open. Inside, darkness and the sharp, metallic tang of blood hit him like a wall. He covered his nose and pressed forward, stepping over scattered toys and furniture strewn across the living room floor, until he reached a bedroom door slightly ajar. Under the weak glow of a bedside lamp, the scene before him nearly buckled his knees. On the small double bed, two young boys lay motionless, their tiny bodies marred with dark stains. Blood was everywhere, soaking through the faded blue sheets, pooling onto the cracked wooden floorboards. James staggered forward, his heart hammering wildly. One of the boys, the older one, was still breathing, his breath shallow and ragged. James knelt down, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He gently touched the boy's shoulder, whispering words of comfort he wasn't even sure the child could hear. New blood seeped from a wound on the boy's back, dripping onto the floor in slow, heavy drops. There was no gun in sight, no signs of another intruder, only the overwhelming stench of death, the oppressive silence, and the chilling sense that the house itself was holding its breath. James stumbled back toward the door, his voice cracking as he shouted to the others outside. "Call 911! Get an ambulance! There are kids hurt inside!" His hands were stained red, his mind reeling from the horror he had just witnessed. Every second ticking by felt like another nail driving into Hope's coffin. One woman sprinted into her home and grabbed the phone, her fingers trembling as she punched in the emergency number. Her voice, choked with panic, filled the line as she screamed for help. From far away, the first faint wail of sirens began to rise, distant at first, then closer and closer, slicing through the heavy winter air. And at that moment, Bentwood Drive, a small, forgotten street in a sleepy Kentucky town, crossed a threshold from peace into tragedy, a place that would never again be the same. The phone lines at Shepherdsville's 911 dispatch lit up, the shrill ringing slicing through the usual morning calm. On the other end, a woman's voice cracked with terror, words tumbling out between broken sobs. "Please come quickly. The kids are dying. We need an ambulance. We need help now." A man's frantic voice jumped in, no less desperate. "They're barely breathing. One's still alive. The other is bleeding bad. Please, save them." Every second stretched painfully thin. Inside house 219, James and a handful of neighbors had stormed into the small, blood-soaked bedroom, their instincts driving them faster than their fear. The phone was switched to speaker mode, the 911 dispatcher barking instructions through the crackling line. "Check for breathing. Begin CPR if needed. Do not move them unless absolutely necessary." James knelt beside the older boy. The child's breath was so faint it was almost invisible, his tiny chest fluttering with a fragile, uneven rhythm. James pressed his hands carefully against the boy's ribcage, pushing in time with the dispatcher's urgent commands, fighting the shaking that overtook his limbs. Lisa, a neighbor from a few houses down, worked feverishly over the younger boy. She tore strips from her own blouse, fashioning crude bandages to slow the bleeding pouring from a gaping wound in the child's back. The room was thick with the smell of blood and fear. The battered ticking of a wall clock filled the silence between shallow breaths, marking time with cruel indifference. Outside, the distant wail of sirens began to rise, thin and far away at first, then growing louder, cutting through the heavy winter air like a blade. But inside the house, it still felt too far too late.
Earlier you said something about PlayStation games or something?
Yeah.
What about it?
I just feel like those games manipulate the children, you know, the YouTube, and just, haven't you ever heard anything like that before?
I mean, yeah.
Like, I really feel like it is manipulating for the children, and they get into the children's homes and, you know, break the families up. That's what I feel.
I mean, you could be right.
I am right.
Yeah.
I know I'm right.
Yeah.
And you do too.
Yeah.
You do.
I mean,
you just know.
The stuff that's on the internet that you have access to now is terrible.
It's terrible for the kids, and they need to stop. Like, my kids are beautiful angels, you know? And
well, you said something about the PlayStation and YouTube and all that, which makes sense and I understand.
I feel like someone tried to manipulate me through my phone, you know, manipulate me through my house, doing stuff to me.
What are they doing to you?
Manipulating my mind. Parker Borders. His name is Parker Borders.
What about him?
He lives in Bardstown, and I'm pretty sure he's been manipulating my mind for like 3 years.
Really?
Through my phone, putting up things in my house, like real evil, dark, weird stuff, like trying to...
Like trying to get you to do things?
Yeah, like alter my mind, like completely like flip me. Like, I'm a woman of God. I don't do...
Yeah.
You don't hurt your children. You protect them, and I feel like I have to protect my children.
Right.
How do you protect them from a problematic system? How do you really serve? People aren't serving these days. Money is everything. It's not. I'll lose it all. I don't care. For my kids, I don't care. I just don't. You just don't do that. I'm very certain. Don't look my kids in the eye. Like, you know, I love my kids.
I know you do.
I would never do something like this unless someone manipulated me.
Did he actually tell you in person?
No, but he controls my phone. All my bills are in his name. Like, has too much access to me,
right.
You know? Right. So I feel like he manipulated my mind, you know? I would never hurt my children.
Who is this Parker guy to you? Just a friend, or?
Like a sugar daddy type thing. I feel like it was portrayed off of revenge or something like that.
Right.
Before, I had a friend who was with him, and she mysteriously passed away in a car wreck. And then now, in my house, you'll see there's like things like my car is going to get blown up, all these weird little, like how stuff is all set up funny, you know, in my house like that. So I just feel uncomfortable. I don't know. I feel like it's him. It's not me. It's not me. I'm right with God, so I know it's not me. I know. It's not in my mind.
Yeah.
It's not me. It just isn't.
Provide you with a firearm, with a gun?
Yes, it was his.
So that gun that was, I guess, in the house, in the bedroom or whatever, that's his gun?
Yes.
Why did he give it to you?
I don't know.
How long ago did he give it to you? You remember? Like years, months, days, what?
I don't know.
Don't remember?
Been a while.
Been a while? What do you remember him telling you in your mind to do, or persuading you to do?
I just don't know. He just, you know, it's happened once before. Like, I got like a weird feeling, like it just felt weird. And then here recently it just felt weird. I'm a good mom. Like, I'm a really good woman. I'm a good mother, you know? I have veneers and everything.
I'm sorry?
I said I have veneers and everything. I don't look like this.
Okay. Do you remember hurting your sons today? I mean, you remember it, but I'm not saying it's you.
It's not me.
It's not you.
It's
like
not. I know it's not me. I would never hurt my children.
Right. He's influencing you.
Manipulating.
Manipulating is the best word.
Through the phones. Wi-Fi, all of that.
Now, once he manipulated you and pushed you into doing this, what do you remember firing a weapon at them today? I mean, you remember that, right? No?
Each time the detective asked if she had pulled the trigger, she found a way to avoid answering the question.
James barked hoarsely. Hold on, just a little longer. They're coming. His hands, slick with blood, refused to steady. His eyes stayed locked on the child's pale face, begging him to keep fighting. Lisa, tears streaming freely, whispered over and over, "Stay with me, baby. Please stay with me." As she clutched the makeshift dressing tighter against the bleeding wound, a soft whimper broke the heavy air, a sound so small, yet it hit them like a thunderclap. The boy was alive. He was still fighting. In that fleeting, fragile moment, hope flared back to life inside that blood-stained room. James, Lisa, and the others ordinary people, thrown into an unimaginable nightmare, forgot their terror. They forgot the cold. They forgot everything except one singular mission: keep those children alive until help arrived. Moments later, flashing red and blue lights flooded Bentwood Drive. Ambulance doors flew open with a metallic slam as paramedics raced inside, their hands steady, their faces carved from stone. They moved with the precision of soldiers on a battlefield, bringing with them every tool, every ounce of training needed to steal life back from death's grip. James stumbled backward, collapsing onto the blood-slicked floor, too drained to stand. Lisa sank to her knees beside him, her arms limp at her sides, her blouse torn and stained red. They watched in silence, their hearts pounding in their throats, as the paramedics worked furiously over the small bodies. In less than a heartbeat, Bentwood Drive had been transformed from an ordinary, sleepy street into a scene of raw, unfiltered tragedy. And though the sirens screamed and the medics fought, a silent truth settled deep in the hearts of everyone there. No matter what happened next, the peace of this little street was gone. Forever. The ambulance had just pulled away, carrying the two fragile bodies clinging to life, when the police closed in around house number 219. The flashing lights painted the cracked walls in pulsing red and blue, casting long, ghostly shadows that seemed to crawl across the frost-bitten lawn. Tiffany Lucas sat slumped on the icy driveway, her blood-stained dress clinging to her shivering frame. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming, she was simply murmuring incoherent fragments of words spilling into the cold morning air. Her hollow eyes stared somewhere distant, locked onto a point that no one else could see. Two officers approached, their heavy boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Despite years of hardened experience, the sight before them made their pace slow, hesitant. A mother crumbled among the ruins of her own creation. "Stand up, Tiffany," one officer said firmly but gently. There was no response. Tiffany only shook her head slightly, whispering, "I'm not well. I don't feel well." With calm, practiced movements, they lifted her to her feet. Her body sagged between them, weightless and unwilling. One of the officers sighed under his breath, a sound not of frustration, but of something far sadder, the weary heartbreak of witnessing another soul lost beyond reach. The cold snap of handcuffs broke the heavy air. The steel clamped around Tiffany's wrists with a finality that was almost ceremonial. Still, she did not resist. She didn't flinch. She only murmured, barely audible, "It wasn't me. Someone else was here." The officers exchanged a quick look, a flash of doubt, or maybe just a silent understanding of how deep her detachment had already become. One gestured toward the patrol car. Tiffany stumbled forward, her steps slow, clumsy, dragging. Her bare feet slapped against the freezing concrete, leaving behind faint smears of blood, a grim breadcrumb trail leading back to the shattered innocence inside the house. Above them, the sky pressed lower, heavier, as if mourning what had unfolded. The only sounds were the soft rustle of dead leaves and the hollow clink of metal with every faltering step she took. As they reached the patrol car, Tiffany's whispers continued. "Someone's in the house, watching me. I'm not well." Her glazed eyes darted erratically, chasing unseen phantoms. An officer gently buckled her into the back seat and closed the door with a solid, echoing slam, a sound that seemed to mark the end of whatever normalcy Tiffany had once known. In the front seat, the officers logged their preliminary notes. There were no signs of forced entry. No stranger had been found. The gun had been recovered from inside the house. And Tiffany, the mother at the center of it all, was now muttering about an invisible stranger she swore had been there. They moved methodically, professionally, but an invisible heaviness settled over them all, the quiet grief for the two young lives slipping away, and the twisted, broken woman now handcuffed in the back seat. Inside the cruiser, Tiffany began to sway, rocking herself back and forth as she muttered fragmented phrases into the stale, frigid air. Her presence filled the car like a storm cloud, suffocating, restless. The vehicle pulled away from Bentwood Drive, the reflection of the squad lights flashing against the frosted windows. A new chapter of darkness had begun for Tiffany Lucas as she was driven to face the inevitable flood of questions that neither she nor anyone else would ever be able to truly answer. Why? In the back seat of the patrol car, Tiffany Lucas had been silent for the first stretch of the ride. She leaned against the cold window, eyes wide open, occasionally fluttering shut as if trying to escape from a nightmare that clung to the edges of her mind. The flickering red and blue lights danced across her pale face, but there was no reaction, no flicker of awareness. She looked like a shell, empty, detached. But the silence didn't last. It began with a whisper, barely audible at first, like the breath of someone talking in their sleep. But then, her voice grew uneven, disjointed, and unmistakably disturbed. "They're in my house. They hear everything I think." The officer in the front seat glanced into the rearview mirror, his brow tightening slightly. Tiffany's muttering became louder, the words spilling from her mouth in feverish bursts, as if she were reporting something urgent to someone who wasn't there. "They planted devices in the outlets. I know they're watching me. The Wi-Fi, the footsteps at night." She began to rock back and forth, her hands clenched and unclenched over and over, as if trying to physically shake off the thoughts spiraling inside her. "There's a man, he won't let me sleep. He walks through the house at night. I hear his steps every night. He's not human." The mood inside the vehicle shifted, not just unease, something heavier, darker. The way she said it, without hesitation, with conviction, made it feel real, even if it couldn't be. She tapped her forehead lightly against the window, eyes darting rapidly. "I know they think I'm crazy, but I know they're controlling me. Through the phone, through the waves. I hear them, each step, each one." Suddenly, she sat upright, staring into the windshield with a vacant intensity. "He's here, right now, in my head." The officer in the passenger seat quietly tapped the recorder button. His glance to his partner said everything. This wasn't just a suspect. This was someone unraveling, live and in real time. Tiffany kept talking. She spoke of mind reprogramming, about how her children were being controlled, and how she had no other choice. Her words grew more disconnected from reality. She mentioned a hidden room in her house that the police hadn't found, a cursed speaker only she could hear. Then came the phrases that sent chills even through seasoned officers. "I could hear their blood dripping, one drop at a time." She repeated her belief that something had taken over her, not a person, not a demon, but a force, a presence. It had entered her through her phone, through the Wi-Fi, had settled into her home's walls, and taken control of her thoughts, her hands, her every action slowly, day by day. The back of that patrol car no longer felt like a holding cell. It felt like a stage where the fractured mind of a mother was breaking in front of them, slipping across the line that separates the sane from the delusional. When the vehicle pulled up to the police station, Tiffany was still mumbling. She didn't seem to know where she was. To her, the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. At the Shepherdsville Police Department, a heavy silence hung in the air as the name on the screen came into focus. Tiffany Lucas, 35 years old, once a small business owner. 7 years ago, Tiffany wasn't the woman now muttering to herself in the back of a police cruiser. She wasn't a mother under arrest for the unthinkable. Back then, she stood in front of local news cameras, smiling brightly at the grand opening of MTIF's One-Stop Shop, a tiny convenience store on West Broadway. In that interview, her voice was full of pride. "I want this place to be a neighborhood stop, a space that feels like family." Behind her, her 2 young sons giggled as they played beside shelves of snacks and toys, the scene brimming with warmth and hope. But just a year later, the store closed without warning. No final post, no explanation. Records showed Tiffany filed for bankruptcy in mid-2017. The reasons: mounting debt, failed vendor contracts, and a total financial collapse. That same year, she was arrested for drug possession, a small amount of methamphetamine found in the glove box of her car. It was a quiet court case. 30 days in jail, 1 year of probation. No headlines, no protests. Just another door quietly closing on a woman the world stopped noticing. Digging deeper, detectives found medical records from a local clinic. Insomnia, anxiety, mood swings. She had been prescribed antidepressants in late 2019. There were no follow-up appointments. A child services caseworker had once visited Tiffany's home in 2021, following a report of possible child neglect. The case was never opened. The note read, "Mother appeared exhausted, deep eye sockets, repetitive speech, avoided eye contact, children were safe, no further action taken." Neighbors described her as quiet, distant. She rarely attended community gatherings. But one thing kept coming up in every account. She loved her kids. You could see it. A former classmate of Tiffany's posted on social media after seeing the story, "Tiffany used to inspire me. She had dreams. She had drive. I can't believe what happened. But now that I think back, there was something missing in her eyes." At the heart of the investigation, a lead detective stared at the timeline board. On one side, a photo of Tiffany in 2016 glowing, full of life, holding her baby boy at the grand opening of her store. Beside it, a photo from this morning, tangled hair, blank stare, wrists in cuffs. Same woman, same face. But somehow, two entirely different souls. Somewhere in the middle, something had broken. And only Tiffany knew what had cracked and when. She had once been described as a devoted mother, a resilient woman. But in the silence of failure, isolation, and unseen battles, something inside her began to quietly unravel. It didn't happen all at once. It was slow, creeping, a darkness that settled over her like a fog no one saw coming. Until one day, it collapsed. Until the voices in her head drowned out the ones calling her back to reality. Until the mother who once protected her children could no longer tell the difference between what was real and what was imagined. Now, investigators weren't just piecing together a crime. They were unearthing the remnants of a woman long lost. Not on the morning of the tragedy, but years before anyone realized she was slipping away. As the flashing police lights dimmed outside, the investigative team moved methodically through house number 219. Every room was swept under the cold glare of their flashlights. Even seasoned officers, men and women who had walked through hundreds of crime scenes, weren't prepared for what they were about to find inside Tiffany Lucas's home. The living room was a wreck. Furniture overturned, piles of dirty clothes tossed across a sagging couch, and unopened boxes of cereal littering the floor. On the worn coffee table, investigators found torn-up photographs, pages ripped from a battered Bible, and scrawled messages written in red ink. "Cleanse the soul. Protect from the dark." The watchers are everywhere. But it was the bedroom, the scene of the shooting, that truly sent a chill through everyone present. The bed where the two boys had been found still sat stained with dark, clotted blood. A detective carefully lifted the mattress, and there, hidden in the shadows underneath, lay a semi-automatic handgun, cold and inert, like a snake waiting to strike again. There was no ammunition box. No sign of a rushed concealment. It looked almost deliberate, as if the gun was placed there, waiting for its final purpose. Around the bed, strange symbols and arrangements caught the eyes of the investigators. Strings were knotted into spirals and hung from the walls, suspending small cloth pouches filled with chicken feathers, garlic cloves, dried roots, and a crude, hand-drawn figure, a faceless man engulfed in flames, towering over two small children. In each corner of the room, melted candles sat in pools of hardened wax, their remnants clawing at the stained carpet. Near the foot of the bed, a ceramic bowl held scraps of paper, each scribbled with Latin phrases mingled with incoherent slang. One officer, a veteran of cult-related investigations, muttered under his breath, "This isn't just superstition. This looks like some kind of protection ritual or an exorcism." Above the headboard, crude charcoal drawings formed a massive circle, an arrow pointing directly toward the spot where the children had once slept. Pinned under the corner of the blanket, investigators found a scrap of paper with a chilling message scrawled in jagged handwriting. "If I die, they'll have no way in." Tiffany's own bedroom was no less disturbing. Mirrors were covered with black cloth. Windows were sealed with aluminum foil and duct tape. Across the ceiling, lines of frantic handwriting spiraled outward. "Keep your thoughts clean. They can hear you." Inside her closet, boxes of unopened medications piled high, most of them anti-anxiety and antipsychotic prescriptions, some dating back several years. Under her pillow, a worn notebook revealed its first page. "Forgive me if I had to do this to protect my blood." Investigators documented every detail. Photographs were snapped, notes scribbled, every eerie artifact logged carefully. But with each discovery, the portrait of Tiffany Lucas became less about simple guilt and more about something infinitely more complex and haunting. It was clear that Tiffany hadn't just fallen apart in a moment of rage. She had been living in a twisted reality of her own creation for years, a world where faith, fear, and isolation blurred into one, until she could no longer tell the difference between saving her children and destroying them. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was the shattered altar of a woman's lost mind. And it told a story far more chilling than anyone could have imagined. A mother so convinced she was saving her children from darkness that she became the very monster she believed she was fighting. In the early hours after Tiffany Lucas's arrest, the atmosphere inside the Shepherdsville Police Department was heavy with confusion. This case wasn't like anything they had seen before. No clear motive, no drugs in her system, no history of domestic violence. Only 2 children clinging to life, and a mother speaking in riddles about Wi-Fi signals and phantom footsteps. They needed answers. So they turned to Dr. Carolyn Hames, a seasoned clinical psychologist who had spent decades working in psychiatric hospitals across Kentucky. After reviewing the case files, the patrol car recordings, and the initial interviews, she didn't hesitate to offer a chilling hypothesis. "I strongly suspect Tiffany is suffering from postpartum psychosis," she said. "A rare but extremely dangerous condition that can develop months or even years after giving birth, particularly in women with a history of depression or mood disorders." "This isn't just depression," Dr. Hames explained. "It's a complete break from reality. The individual may believe their children are possessed, being watched, or that they must save them from an invisible threat." The investigators exchanged glances. Suddenly, Tiffany's mutterings in the patrol car no longer seemed random. Her whispers, "If I die, they can't get in, and I can hear their blood dripping," now pointed to a far more terrifying internal struggle. Dr. Hames continued. Tiffany didn't act out of hatred or pure violence. In her psychotic state, she believed she was protecting her children maybe from demons, maybe from an invisible force, or, in this case, from what she saw as technological mind control. The room grew still as the recordings were played back again. "They control me through the phone. My thoughts aren't my own anymore. I covered the mirrors so they couldn't watch me from the other side. I had to do it. If I didn't, they would take my kids forever." Dr. Hames added, "In psychosis, everything makes sense internally. They don't see themselves as perpetrators. They see themselves as saviors." Slowly, a tragic portrait of Tiffany Lucas began to emerge. A devoted mother, isolated and struggling with depression, slipping into a delusional world where Wi-Fi signals became instruments of evil, and the internet a trap for the soul. Police reviewed old medical notes, prescriptions that were never refilled, missed therapy sessions, brief warnings that never escalated into action. Each isolated piece, by itself, seemed small, but when connected, they painted a chilling psychological map. Dr. Hames's theory wasn't an excuse. It didn't undo what had happened, but it offered something the investigators desperately needed: a way to understand how a mother could cross such an unimaginable line. Not because of a conspiracy, not because of an intruder, but because her own mind betrayed her, slowly, silently, and fatally. As the meeting ended, the room remained heavy with unspoken grief. One detective whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe, if someone had noticed earlier. Just one phone call. One visit. One real conversation. Maybe." But maybe could never bring the boys back. Amid the sterile reports and fragmented statements, a more complicated portrait of Tiffany Lucas began to emerge, a story not written solely in blood, but in countless small fractures from years of invisible pressure. As a young woman, Tiffany had dreamed of the simple things: a small family, a steady job, a life built quietly within her community. But reality chipped away at those dreams in ways no outsider could fully understand. After the collapse of her small business, Tiffany didn't just lose her sole income. She lost her sense of purpose. Her store had once been a beacon of hope, a symbol of starting fresh. When it failed, it took her fragile confidence with it. Financial records showed she was drowning in debt. Utility bills, credit card balances, overdue notices piling up on the kitchen counter. There was no partner to lean on. Tiffany was a single mother to 2 young boys, isolated from extended family, surrounded only by a few casual acquaintances who barely scratched the surface of her life. Each day was a new battlefield. How to afford groceries? How to cover school fees? How to keep the dilapidated house from slipping away into foreclosure? The outside world didn't see the struggle. While Tiffany was fighting for survival, social media painted a relentless fantasy of perfect mothers, immaculate homes, beaming children, eating colorful breakfasts, glamorous family vacations. Every glowing photo was a dagger, carving deeper into the belief that she was enough. She stopped posting pictures. There were no more birthday parties for the boys splashed across Facebook timelines. No cheerful updates. Only dark, endless nights spent scrolling through images of lives that felt like cruel taunts against her own failures. She didn't see survival as an achievement. She saw it as proof she was falling behind. Friends would later say, "Back in high school, Tiffany was always laughing, always lifting others up. But after she had the boys, it was like a light went out. She always looked tired. She always apologized, as if she thought she wasn't good enough." It wasn't that Tiffany lacked strength. It wasn't that she lacked love for her children. But when every small failure stacked up, when every effort ended in another closed door, even the brightest spirit could be snuffed out. And while Tiffany struggled, the world kept spinning indifferent. No one taught her how to survive the impossible expectations. No one told her that sometimes just breathing through the day was enough. Instead, she was left alone to carry the crushing weight of survival while measuring herself against standards that no one could live up to. And eventually, the weight became too much. It didn't come crashing down in a dramatic explosion. It crumbled slowly, quietly, under the unbearable whispers of doubt, shame, and fear that grew louder with each passing day, until they drowned out everything else. During the early interrogation sessions at the police station, Tiffany Lucas sat in eerie silence for hours, her eyes locked onto some invisible point on the cold metal table. No tears. No screams. Only a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, as if she were locked in an invisible battle deep inside herself. Then, suddenly, she began to speak. Her voice was low, heavy, each word landing like a stone dropped into deep water. PlayStation. YouTube. Parker. To Tiffany, these names weren't random. In the twisted reality she now lived in, PlayStation wasn't just a gaming console. It was a portal, a device that allowed them, faceless, hidden entities, to infiltrate her mind and take over her every thought. She explained that every time she turned on the console for her sons, she felt strange waves seeping into her brain, planting dark thoughts that she knew were not her own. YouTube, in her mind, wasn't a platform for videos. It was a weapon, broadcasting invisible signals and secret commands, instructing her to commit unspeakable acts. But the name that truly caught the investigators' attention was Parker. No one in Shepherdsville knew a Parker connected to Tiffany. No friends, no family, no neighbors. Yet in her fragmented account, Tiffany insisted that Parker was the one behind everything. A man she had never met in person but who haunted her dreams, appeared in the static of her television and whispered to her through phantom messages on her phone. According to Tiffany, Parker communicated through electric hums, through walls, through power outlets. He whispered to her that her sons were being taken over, and that only through a decisive act could she free their innocent souls. The interviews, captured on grainy video, showed no signs of deceit. No manipulation. No attempts to hide. Only a chilling certainty. The kind of certainty born not from calculation, but from a mind that could no longer tell fiction from truth. One detective later said, "She didn't seem to know how crazy it sounded. To her, it was as real as the room we were sitting in." Every word from Tiffany painted the same harrowing picture. A complete collapse of reality. Ordinary household objects had become instruments of control. Everyday technology turned into tools of possession. And Parker, whether an imagined figure or a manifestation of her deepest fears, became the anchor that justified the unthinkable in her broken mind. Psychological experts reviewing the recordings agreed almost instantly. Tiffany Lucas's grasp on reality hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. There was no more boundary between what was real and what was hallucinated. No more distinction between the truth and the desperate inventions of a drowning mind. And in those final, irreversible moments before she pulled the trigger, Tiffany truly believed she was fighting back against a force of pure evil, not committing a crime, but performing an act of salvation. While combing through Tiffany Lucas's old phone and battered laptop, forensic investigators stumbled across a hidden trove of text messages, conversations Tiffany had never once mentioned during her interrogations. The messages weren't linked to a saved contact, just a nameless number. No profile photo, no identifying details. But the content of those conversations sent a chill through the entire investigative team. Buried within the fragmented exchanges were long discussions about freeing the mind and sacrificing to save the children's souls. One message from the unnamed man read, "They don't just want the bodies of our children, they want their consciousness. If you want to save them, you must act first." Another, timestamped at 2:00 a.m., warned, "The signals sent through electronics are gateways for the dark forces. Time is running out." Tiffany's replies were laced with fear and resignation. "I hear them every night. I know I have to do it, but I'm scared. I don't want to lose them." The more investigators read, the clearer and more horrifying the picture became. Tiffany wasn't simply lost in her own delusions. There was someone feeding them, nurturing them, guiding her down an irreversible path. The conversations stretched across months. Over and over, Tiffany was urged to free her children before it was too late. The mysterious man painted a world where a silent war raged between good and evil, convincing her that the only way to protect her sons was through an unspeakable act. One particularly chilling message read, "Your sacrifice will be rewarded. Today's pain is the gateway to their eternal freedom." Reading through the exchanges, investigators could almost feel the suffocating grip tightening around Tiffany's mind. She had been drowning not just in her own psychosis, but in the poisonous words of someone else, whispering to her from the darkness. No one yet knew who the man was. He could have been a stranger from the twisted corners of the internet, a conspiracy theorist gone mad, or something even more sinister. Someone who preyed on fragile souls for his own satisfaction. Whoever he was, his influence was undeniable. He had planted a vision in Tiffany's mind, a vision where murder became salvation and death became deliverance. The final messages between them were sent just days before the tragedy. "You know what you must do. Be strong. No turning back." And then nothing. No goodbye. No warning. The thread simply ended. What remained was a woman, alone, terrified, believing with every fiber of her broken being that she was doing the right thing. In the dim interrogation room, the cold glow of Tiffany's phone illuminated the faces of hardened detectives. No one spoke. Only one grim truth filled the silence. Tiffany Lucas hadn't stumbled into madness alone. Someone had held her hand and led her there. In the final moments before tragedy struck the small house on Bentwood Drive, Tiffany Lucas was no longer just a mother weighed down by debt and loneliness. She had transformed into a soldier in an invisible war, a battle between light and darkness, where the enemy wasn't human, but unseen forces she believed were closing in on her children's souls. Post-incident analyses, both forensic and psychological, agreed on one chilling point. Tiffany acted with the absolute belief that she was saving her children, not harming them. When she entered the bedroom and pulled the handgun from under the mattress, there was a strange, terrifying certainty in her movements. In Tiffany's fractured mind, the weapon wasn't a tool of violence. It was a key, the only means to open the door to salvation for her sons. Through her distorted lens, every shallow breath from her boys was a sign that the darkness was already taking hold. The PlayStation, the smartphone, the Wi-Fi router, they weren't harmless objects anymore. They were conduits of corruption, pulling her children further and further from her reach. And Tiffany believed there was only one path left: liberation. A bullet, in her mind, wasn't an end. It was a rescue. No one else witnessed what unfolded in that small, blood-stained room, no one but Tiffany and her boys. But through the scattered evidence, the position of the bodies, the trajectory of the bullets, the hastily scribbled notes about the door to freedom, investigators painstakingly reconstructed those harrowing final minutes. Tiffany likely stood at the foot of the bed, gripping the gun tightly. Her children, still drowsy, must have looked up at their mother, unaware of the desperation flashing behind those once familiar eyes. There might have been a moment of hesitation, a flicker of reason trying to claw its way back. But then, the whispered command in her mind spoke again. No turning back, save them. Without blinking, without trembling, Tiffany pulled the trigger. The small room filled instantly with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the shattering cries, the metallic stench of blood. But in Tiffany's broken world, she didn't hear the screams. She didn't smell the blood. She didn't see the terror on her children's faces. She saw only one thing: redemption. One shot. And another. Until the chaotic noise faded into a heavy, deafening silence, the kind of silence she had come to believe was peace. Afterward, Tiffany dropped the gun onto the floor and stood still among the wreckage she had created. She didn't flee. She didn't try to hide. Because in her mind, the sacred task was complete. Blood trails stretched from the bedroom to the driveway, where neighbors later found Tiffany hands trembling, eyes hollow, mumbling incoherent words about rescue and liberation. To the outside world, Tiffany Lucas would forever be a murderer. But inside the nightmare, she could no longer escape. She was a warrior, a mother who had sacrificed everything to save the children she loved most. It was a horrifying act, wrapped in the twisted disguise of love. A tragedy born not of evil, but of delusion, isolation, and unseen despair. House number 219 on Bentwood Drive now sits silent. No more laughter echoing from the yard. No Christmas lights twinkling like they did the year before. Just a wall of flowers, plush toys resting gently on the front steps, and two framed photos, two young faces frozen in time. Carl and Meredith Lucas, the paternal grandparents of the two boys, made their first public appearance weeks after the tragedy. Their faces were gaunt from sleepless nights, their eyes hollow, like people who had walked through a storm no one else could truly imagine. "I still remember the last time I hugged him," Carl said softly, choking back tears as he spoke about the older boy. "He showed me his math test. He got a perfect score. He loved numbers, said he wanted to be an engineer, like his dad." Meredith sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She didn't cry. The tears had long since run dry sometime after the call that shattered everything, after learning that the boys she once helped raise were now lying cold on an autopsy table. "We don't hate Tiffany," she said quietly. "We just can't understand. None of us saw it coming. No one saw her slipping." She paused, then her voice broke, sharp and low. "We lost everything. Not just our grandchildren, but our daughter-in-law, and whatever faith we had left in the world." To the public, Tiffany is now the face of horror. But to Carl and Meredith, she was once the shy, soft-spoken mother who never left the boys' sides, the woman who texted in the middle of the night asking if a slight fever meant she should give them Tylenol. She was the one who used to call them just to say, "Thank you for babysitting, for birthday gifts, for being there." "I don't know what she became," Carl admitted, his voice cracking. "I don't know what broke inside her. But I know this, she loved those kids. So much she couldn't take her eyes off them." When asked how they're coping, Carl stared out the window of the interview room, watching the winter wind strip the trees bare. "Every morning I wake up and ask myself, was it real or just a nightmare?" he whispered. "Then I walk down the hallway and there's no sound, no little feet stomping, no one calling me grandpa. And I know the nightmare's still going." The family had collapsed. The boy's father, Tiffany's ex-husband, was completely broken. No one had the strength to piece the fragments of their lives back together. The funeral was quiet. No music, no speeches. Just whined and weeping beneath a gray Kentucky sky. "They say time heals. But some wounds don't heal. They just go deeper," Meredith said, her voice distant, as if speaking to something far beyond the room. "People talk about tragedies like they belong to one person. One criminal. One victim. One headline. But the truth is far crueler. Every bullet Tiffany fired didn't just take 2 lives. It shattered an entire family and left behind souls still breathing but no longer whole. On the day of Tiffany Lucas's trial, the skies over Shepherdsville were heavy with gray. A cold wind swept through the steps of the Bullitt County Courthouse, where reporters, community members, and grieving family gathered as if all were bracing for an ending, even if no one was sure whether it would bring justice or simply another bitter chill to an already unbearable tragedy. Tiffany entered the courtroom in a pale orange prison jumpsuit, wrists loosely shackled, her head bowed, hair unbrushed and falling across her face. She looked at no one. She said nothing. She simply sat a faint shadow beneath fluorescent lights, seemingly detached from everything unfolding around her. The state prosecutor, Lawrence Hodge, was the first to speak. His voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble, but every word dropped with the weight of a stone. The state seeks 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for Tiffany Lucas for the premeditated intentional murders of 2 minor children. The courtroom fell silent. The only sound was the wind rattling faintly against the windows. Reporters tapped their keyboards. Family members lowered their heads. Tiffany did not move. Then came the victim impact statements. Carl Lucas, grandfather of the boys, rose slowly, gripping the back of the bench for support. His hands trembled. His voice was gravel carved out by weeks of sorrow. "There's no sentence that will bring them back," he said. "But if this court grants mercy today, someone out there might believe that what she did can be forgiven." He looked toward Tiffany. She didn't lift her eyes. Behind him, Meredith Lucas clutched a faded blue scarf once worn by her youngest grandson, pressing it to her face as if trying to hold on to the last breath of his memory. Tiffany's court-appointed attorney spoke briefly. "My client is not in a mental state to make a statement, but she understands the consequences of her actions." Judge Harrelson, known for his stern, measured tone, turned to the defendant. "Miss Lucas, do you have anything to say?" Silence. A long pause. Then Tiffany slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were clouded, lost in some distant fog. She simply shook her head. No apology. No tears. No denial. No defense. Someone in the gallery began to sob. A young mother held her daughter tightly, staring at Tiffany, once a mother herself, now a hollow figure on the defendant's bench. The judge's voice was steady, devoid of drama. "The court hereby sentences Tiffany Lucas to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole." The gavel fell, one sharp, final sound that didn't just seal Tiffany's fate, but echoed through the broken structure of a family, and into the dark corners where the signs of this tragedy had long gone unnoticed. As she was escorted from the courtroom, Tiffany didn't look back, just a small, silent figure disappearing behind a heavy door. Leaving behind a room filled with frost, a family in ruins, and a question no one could answer. How does a mother go so far and no one sees it coming? When Judge Harrelson's gavel struck the bench, ending the trial, the courtroom froze. No applause. No outbursts. Only tear-stained eyes watching Tiffany Lucas being escorted out, no goodbyes, no backward glance, no visible acknowledgement that she had ever truly been there. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. A sentence that many agreed was appropriate. But for most in the room, it wasn't closure. It was a scar, one that would never fully heal. The case of Tiffany Lucas didn't just horrify the community of Shepherdsville because of its brutality. It horrified them because of what it revealed. A trail of missed warnings, ignored signs, and quiet cries for help that fell through the cracks until it was far too late. Neighbors recalled Tiffany wandering the neighborhood at night, mumbling to herself, her eyes wild and distant. They remembered her covering windows with aluminum foil, blaming phone signals for attacking her thoughts. One person considered calling the police once, but decided not to, chalking it up to just a stressed-out single mom. A preschool teacher once noticed the older boy flinching around his mother, but without solid evidence, she didn't escalate the concern. A nurse wrote in her file that Tiffany showed signs of psychosis, but because she came alone, without a guardian or advocate, the note was closed out within 3 weeks. They had seen. They had wondered. They had doubted. But they didn't act. And so each small warning became part of a storm, one that no one took responsibility for, even as they stood in the wreckage it left behind. After the trial, Shepherdsville held town halls, workshops, and press conferences. They talked about mental health, about community accountability, about listening instead of judging. But for the family of the two boys, all the talking came too late. No awareness campaign could bring them back. No symposium could patch the holes ripped through a once whole family. A local journalist wrote in the aftermath, "This wasn't a failure because Tiffany was a monster. It was a failure because we let a mother collapse in silence and no one reached out a hand." In a small church down the road, 2 candles still burn each night beneath framed photos of the boys. Locals take turns lighting them, leaving notes and flowers. "We're sorry we didn't see you. If only someone had asked, 'Are you okay?' No child deserves this. No one should be left behind." Tiffany Lucas has since vanished from public view. Her name no longer headlines the news. Her image is blurred in most articles. But what she left behind, the things no one dared confront for years, still lingers, haunting a town that can no longer pretend it didn't know. And the questions remain. If we saw it, why didn't we stop it? If someone had spoken up, would they still be alive? The case is closed. But the echoes remain. And they form a third sentence, not against Tiffany, but against all who stood by, who saw something, and looked away.